Alright, if you all find a seat, then I can get started. My name is Walter. I'm from Holland. I run a company called Roland Data, and I'll talk to you today about the things that you shouldn't do with Puppet. There's a lot of really cool things that you can do, and a lot of people smarter than me have shown you a lot of cool things today, and they will be showing you the next day as well. But I thought I'd tell you some of the things that you shouldn't do with Puppet. I have to apologize in advance for my slides. I have been extremely busy with work. I know it's no excuse at all, but it's the reality of the situation, so it's all pretty on you. But I hope that it's about the content and not about the design of the slides. So yeah, I've been working with Puppet since 0.24, 0.5 or something like that, and it's been going through quite a bit of evolution since then, and in that time there's been things that were made possible, or functionality that was built that was not necessarily that was not necessarily very good to use, but it is possible, and I'll show you some of the things that you can use but you shouldn't use, and some of the things that are just not pretty. So I have about 2.5 years of experience in Puppet, and I can honestly say that it changed my sysadmin life. I rarely log into a command line anymore, and love it. I teach a lot of Puppet fundamentals classes. I've taught a lot of classes in Asia, and we also do Puppet consulting, and in the process I've had my eyes bleed with some of the things that people do, which they're simply not aware of how bad it is. So in this presentation, I'll take a little bit of a different approach. Instead of standing here and talking to you the whole time, I'll show you a slide that has mistakes on it. Hopefully only the mistakes that I intentionally made, and it'll be up to you guys to tell me what's wrong with it and why it's wrong. So there's two types of mistakes in general that people make. One is design mistakes, which are, I consider them things that the language makes it possible, but that doesn't mean that you should be using it. And the other part is the language. Sorry, that was the language mistakes, and the design mistakes are syntax that you can use, but it's not really the right way to do things, and if you use it, it won't actually not work. It'll just cause you trouble later, so you're better off avoiding it. So yeah, let's start with the first slide. It's relatively easy, but already there's a lot of things that are wrong with this code. So consider a file, ssh.pp, with this code in it. Can anybody, I intentionally made about 3 mistakes. Can anybody tell me what they are?
Well, the name of the classes are not the name, the files where they are present.
That's one.
So they have a comma at the end of a parameter, which is always good to have.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
you have 2 different classes in the same file.
Yeah. So the answer was there's 2 different classes in the same file, which is something that you should never do. Always just use a single class in a single file. It has to do with the autoloader mechanism, which is also the second mistake. The fact that the class name is not the same as the file name means that the autoloader will not be able to find this class. So the autoloader mechanism, for those of you who are not familiar with it, is the mechanism that makes sure that if you name a class the same way that the file is named, it can be automatically found. So if anywhere in your repository, if you have the class SSH here, if this class name would be SSH, like here, the autoloader can find it anywhere in your repository if you just say include SSH. Some other mistakes are verbs in the class names. It's a common beginner's mistake. It's not necessarily wrong, but the problem is that if you use verbs in Puppet, you put yourself in the wrong mindset. The idea is that in Puppet, you define the state you want something to be in, not the transition you want it to go through. So by using the class name SSH install, you put yourself in the mindset that this piece of code will actually install SSH. And it's wrong, because what this piece of code does is make sure that SSH is present. If it's already present, it doesn't do anything. So by not using verbs in your... I'm very sorry about that. By not using... My phone is set to silent, but it isn't alarm. Sorry. By not using verbs in your class names, you can teach yourself to not think in the way of making a change in your code. So yeah, these classes, in my opinion, they should be combined. If they're very extensive, then you can possibly separate them. But for simple functionality like this, it's easier to combine them. The present parameter, by simply using a class parameter called state or whatever that you default to present, you can very easily make sure that these that you can also use this class to disable the SSH functionality. So that's those are the most obvious mistakes. Next up. Anybody? What was that?
I would use a cron icon to do this.
Yeah, so he said that he would use a cron to do something like this, which is partly, it's part of the what's wrong with this. There's not anything wrong with this. It's just that this doesn't do what most people think it does. This will not execute apt-get update within between 2 and 4 every day. This will, if Puppet is run between these hours, the apt-get update will go through, and if it's run outside of those hours, it won't go through. So the common pitfall is here that if Puppet doesn't run between 2 and 4, this will not actually get executed. So the only thing you can use schedules for is to stop things from happening outside of the schedule that you define. Other than that, this would be much better be done with a cron job indeed, or in some other way. But in general, schedules is something that you should probably stay away from unless you have a really good reason to not stay away from them. It's cool functionality, but unfortunately, it gives people the wrong idea of what they can do with it. The next one. Anybody? It's an easy one. Yeah, so this is an unfortunate Ruby problem where if you quote the word false, it actually becomes a string. And in Ruby, any variable that's not nil is actually true. So very unfortunate, false is actually true. And it's a very easy mistake to make because it's just 2 single quotes, and it's I've seen it many times. And then there's solutions to this where people start testing for strings for a variable to be the string false, the boolean false, or 0 or 1, or all kinds of exotic versions. But in general, just try not to use this. If you put this through, I don't know if Puppet lint will catch it, I presume so. At least Geppetto will catch it. Geppetto is an extension for Eclipse, and it does some pretty neat code checking. And for one of the many things that will catch is this kind of mistake. yeah, so be careful with this. You'll also see it every once in a while in modules that are not yours, and sometimes it'll work, or it'll stay hidden until until you run into it. But
isn't there a function to cache this kind of function?
yeah, I think in standard lib there's a function for it. Yeah. So this one is it's a very simple example of a much bigger problem. Can anybody tell me what the problem is here? And I've seen this in use, so it's really. Sorry?
The process is called HTTP.
Yeah, that depends on what operating system you're on.
Depends on the operating system.
This is just what you should do.
Exactly. Well, there's a much bigger problem here. It's glaringly obvious once you see it, but
You're not using Puppet there, you're just doing something not in the correct way.
yeah, exactly. So what you see is execs. The obvious solution here is that it should be a service and not an exec. The actual occurrences of this problem are much more complicated than just this. The problem is that people use execs, especially people that are not very experienced in Puppet. They tend to resort to an exec for a lot of things that they should not use execs for. And it leads to horrible things like this. This is actually taken from an example I've seen. In this case, it should simply be a service. But the bigger problem is that the exec functionality is basically your last resort. There are many things that you cannot do in any other way than an exec, but most of the time there is some other way to solve your problem than to use an exec. And basically when you see yourself write the word exec, you should stop and think, is there any other way that I can achieve what I'm trying to do right now? You see a lot of uses of exec that can just simply be avoided if you think a little bit harder. Sometimes it requires writing a custom type provider, or maybe you can even get away with a define, or simply just use a service in this case, or whatever. Where I see this happen is when people try to install an unsigned package in Debian. You cannot install an unsigned package using the package provider, using the package resource type, and then they resort to using an exec instead. In my opinion, that's the wrong approach. You should instead make sure that you have a signed version of that package somewhere. If that means that you have to repackage it, then so be it, but that's the correct approach to solving this problem, instead of resorting to an exec to fix a problem that you shouldn't have in the first place. Yeah, other than that, execs, they have their use. But again, it's one of those things that were invented for corner cases, for edge cases, and not for general use. This one is a little bit more, yeah, it's very common. I see people use this. I'm not a big fan of it, but can anybody tell me what is wrong with this?
You should use OS family instead of operating system.
Yeah, oh yeah, okay. You said you should use OS family instead of operating system. That's a minor thing. I mean, it could be that you're actually searching for the operating system in this case. But in general, yeah, OS family is better. Anyone else?
Switch the thing out to a ground class, you can actually pull a variable from packet from instead of doing this in place within every resource.
Yes. Yeah, you can use a class class parameter to circumvent the problem, and that is what the problem here is. Has a couple of resolutions. The problem is that by testing for operating system in statement like this, is that you assume automatically that if we're not using Ubuntu, that the package name for SSH is SSH, which might be true for your environment, but if you run that module on a different person's environment, then they might have a different operating system than. So let's say that you have Ubuntu and CentOS, and you think, okay, well, Ubuntu it's an OpenSSH server, and CentOS is, I don't know, is it SSH or is it also OpenSSH servers? Anyway, the problem is that for your environment, everything that's not Ubuntu might have the package name SSH, but that doesn't make it portable code, and it makes it quite dangerous, because what if you at some point add another operating system to your environment that happens to have a different package name for the SSH server? All of a sudden you'll be you'll run into problems here. Whereas if you instead take this equation out of the resource, like this, for instance, instead, as you see now, I'm so used to being able to put my finger in front of the slide. Arms are not that long. So if you take the testing outside of the resource, all of a sudden you can much more nicely fail this resource. Instead of assuming a default value for everything that doesn't match your case, now you can say the default value is undef, and if the package name is undef, then just fail with an error message, and it will be much more clear that your module doesn't support that operating system. Yes?
Maybe clear even, I think, there's a case on top to define
yes.
the variable and have it fail in the case and then keep the packaging with
yes. The other solution, I think I have it somewhere in one of the next slides. The even better solution is to use a case statement instead, where in each case of the case statement, you set a variable, the variable packet SSH package name to the right package, and then in the default you move that fail unsupported OS into the default clause of the case statement, and that allows you to keep all the checking in one place, and then this bottom part.
And you can leave out the name thing and just put SSH package name as the name.
Yeah, the problem might be dependencies afterwards.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Oh, sorry. That's what we use here in the package resource in the bottom there. You see package, and we name the title of the package SSH, and then the name attribute is set to SSH package name. The reason for this is a common example is, for instance, Apache, because the package on CentOS is HTTPD, I think, and on Debian it's Apache 2. If you put the SSH package name variable as the title of this resource, everywhere where you are going to refer to your Apache package, you will have to determine the right name of the Apache package on that operating system. That will mean that you'll have to duplicate that logic in many different places. Whereas if you do it like this, you can refer to the SSH package in every location throughout your whole repository with the name SSH. And you'll always be sure that it underwater actually takes the right package to install. Yeah, so that especially when you're talking about, for instance, Apache and virtual hosts, you'll see that in your virtual host, you want to require the Apache package, and instead you can now say package Apache instead of package HTTPD or package Apache 2, and it saves you duplicating logic in many places. saves you duplicating the logic into many different places. So yeah, what you always need to think about, at least what we always try to think about, is not making a module suitable for just your environment, the current state of your environment, but have it be more flexible so that it can suit any environment. Because almost no environment is completely static, they will always be changing, and this is why we write public code in the first place. So do yourself a favor and do it properly the first time around. It saves you time the second time around. Yeah, this one is very much related to the previous one. Anyone?
You should pull operating system from the global scope directly, because this might be defined somewhere else right now.
Yes. There's two problems here. One is the scoping problem with the operating system variable. Operating system is a fact, and facts are always in the top scope. So this is a mistake in the slide, but there should be a double colon in front of the operating system variable to ensure that it looks for the fact and not coincidentally looks for a local variable called operating system. Now, I would also advise you to never use a variable name that is equal to a fact, but yeah, that's a different story. The other problem here is that, again, as we also saw in the previous this slide, this slide, this one assumed that if it wasn't Ubuntu, the package name is SSH. The same thing goes for this one, except it's a little bit less obvious. If we're not on Red Hat or CentOS, then we're on DB. Well, obviously the chance is relatively big, but you know, there are people who run a ton of other operating systems. So instead, in the default class, in the default clause of the case statement, write fail unsupported operating system for this module. That way, anybody who uses your module can clearly see that that there's a problem here. This one is taken from an actual WordPress module. Yeah, can anybody tell me what's wrong with this? Sorry?
No quotes about it.
Which value are we talking about? Oh no, that actually doesn't matter. Puppet can do. Yeah, that's a different story. Yeah, it will match correctly. It's just that there should be quotes around each of the cases for those selectors. But there's a much more big, because this comes from a module that's on the Puppet forge as we speak, and
But it still doesn't fail.
yeah, also it still doesn't fail. The much bigger problem with this is that we're talking about a WordPress module that is going to install Apache, PHP, and the PHP MySQL module.
It will probably clash with other.
Yeah, this is very nice if you have a single web server with one WordPress install and that's all it runs. In pretty much any other case, this will horribly fail, and it will make you regret the moment you install this module. So what you always need to realize is that when your module, for in this case WordPress, needs other software, instead of taking the shortcut of including the other software in your module, make a new module. There is no harm in making an Apache module that even if your needs are this simple. Make an Apache module that only has one class Apache and that has only one package resource. That way you don't have to have to worry about it, because then you can have another module, maybe it's a Drupal module, maybe you decide that you want to install God knows what kind of software, but then you can refer to the Apache class instead of getting into a clash over which module is responsible for installing Apache. And in this case it's pretty obvious, but there are also more obscure cases when it comes to log rotate or simple software. My personal approach is that anytime I use something that is its own piece of software, it needs to go in its own separate module. And in many environments, especially the simple little auxiliary tools, you don't really need to write an extensive module that covers every case. Just start with a simple class with one package resource and maybe the configuration file, and don't bother in extending it until you actually need it, but at least extract it from the main module. Yes.
The previous example, shouldn't those variables at the bottom be qualified?
They are local variables, so this is fine.
Okay. Are you sure?
Yes. Because it's from the same class. If they were defined in a different class,
Okay, I understand, but if they weren't defined, and if they were defined somewhere else, wouldn't that be a problem with some versions of stuff?
well, I'm not exactly sure what you're getting at. I mean, you want to test for the values of these variables, or what do you propose?
Well, we use older versions of Puppet, so
Yeah.
we always qualify all variables to make sure.
So you want to, yeah, you could say there, $WordPress : Apache. That's fine. It's not wrong. It's also not wrong to do it this way. This is why the scoping was removed from Puppet 3, because exactly that kind of stuff happened. Yeah. If you're using old versions, then yes, it might make sense to qualify them properly. I hope, yeah, that's true.
Mark, with the previous example, you said that this is coming from a module on the Puppet Forge. But the solution you gave was one if you're
Delete the
doing
module
your
from
own
the Forge.
Sorry?
Delete the module from the Forge.
That's also a solution.
Sorry.
But let's say that you have something like that you want to deploy a module on Puppet Forge that really requires Apache to be installed. How would you solve that?
Yeah.
That's what I would think of, yes.
Yeah, I mean, so if you really want to do this, then you need to have a dependency for the, let's see, there should be more below this, but I left it out. The WordPress archive is a file, and there you could put a dependency on that file, saying before you install this file, you need Apache installed. And the best solution would be to fix this problem and put a pull request into the Puppet to this WordPress module. That would be the best solution, and then hope that it gets picked up. Next up. Anyone?
Permissions are wrong for directories.
That's one, yes.
The mode should be included.
Sorry?
The mode should be included.
Should it be? It's an integer, right?
It should be included, otherwise
It
you
sure
will
should be.
get
There's
the zero.
zero.
Okay. That was, as I thought before this session, I'm going to learn something new today, and we'll just have it.
But then it actually tells you that you should include it.
Yeah, I didn't have time to pull all the code through Lin. Some of the code you can see there in classes called test. Those are the ones I could test. The rest of them were, I hope I did that right. Yeah, this is a bit of a topic of discussion. What is wrong here? But in my opinion, it's wrong. It depends a little bit on your style. I think in the Puppet style guide that you can find on the Puppet website. This is also mentioned that putting resources in an array like this and then applying the whole array at the same time should be avoided if possible. For instance, yes, this should be 0700, but consider that here you have all these directories defined. Oh wow, there's more wrong. It should be ensure directory. The reason that it's wrong is that it was a copy paste. First it was files, and then they decided to do the same thing with directories instead of files. But anyway, consider that it says ensure directory and mode 755. What happens when you decide that, oh wait, I want my etc MySQL directory to be 0700? All of a sudden, it becomes very easy to quickly change to 0644 to 0755. And the problem that you'll then have is that the other two directories also change permissions. So if instead you wrote them out from the beginning, you will have 3 separate resources, and if you need to make changes to one of them, the chances that you'll keep it well structured are much higher.
Yeah, so for directories, directory file resources, Tucker will actually set the execute bit. So 644 is actually
Yeah, it will work, right? Yeah, I noticed it, yeah. So this will actually work, but it still...
Well, it'll be files in this case.
Yeah.
Why not set defaults?
Sorry?
Why not set defaults?
You could use a file default.
Yeah, I'm also not a big fan of resource defaults. The problem with that is similar. It's similar to what you do here. Then you would set the... it's very easy to change the resource default, and especially in larger modules, it's very easy to change the resource default and thereby changing all of the resources in your module, including the ones that you didn't necessarily think about, the ones that you wanted to change. Obviously, in this specific case, it would be okay because you would have a resource default that would set everything to 0644, and then in this etc MySQL resource, you would override that to be 0700. So it is a solution, but resource defaults are, I personally try to avoid them wherever possible, because especially in larger modules, they're quite dangerous. Also, I don't know if it was still in 2.7, but at least in 2.6, resource defaults would do unpredictable things if you had subclasses or classes that were included in a class. They would work through in the classes that were included, and you change the ownership of files that you weren't even thinking about. So I just learned to try not to use them.
And also resource defaults, if you use them and somebody new comes in, they have to learn all your defaults before they can understand it.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. That's the other thing. If you have a resource default, that would mean that in the second and third version, the whole user group mode, all of these attributes would be left out. And for somebody new who comes in, they see only the ensure attribute and none of the user group and mode. And it's very easy for them to assume that there is no default unless they look up or in a different file to find those resource defaults. So yeah, it depends on your preference. This is very much a topic that you can debate about. But personally, I try to stay away from resource defaults, and I try to go the longer way around by defining them specifically.
Do you also do that in case of recursive directories, which probably doesn't do really that well?
Yeah, so recursive directories are, I'll handle them later. Recursive directories is something that Puppet is not good at, and I'll explain a little bit why. I hope that I have it correct, but I know that there's enough people in this room to correct me if I'm not, if I don't have it correct. So I'll get to that in a little bit. So this is all. This will work, but it's dangerous. Can somebody tell me why?
Order the task.
Sorry?
Order the task.
Depending on the
Yeah, but let's say that it is defined. That is part. Actually, that's part of the problem. I have outlined it here. So one of the problems is that let's say you have these two clauses in different places. So the top one lives in module A, and the other one lives in module B, which is usually why you will want to do this. Basically, most people that do this are too lazy to extract the resource into a third space. What happens here is that it's order dependent. So as you can see, in the top version we set the group to root, and in the bottom version we set the group to puppet. You cannot really tell which one will be applied. I believe that in Puppet 3 the ordering algorithm has been stabilized so that it will always choose the same ordering between different Puppet runs. But in older versions of Puppet, you could have a Puppet run that would choose one order, and then the next Puppet run could choose a different order. So by doing that, by using this define function, it will actually not, this will actually not fail, except that, especially in older versions, it might start switching around the group attribute of your temp foo file from root to Puppet and back and back and back. And you cannot really depend on which version you're getting. The more common occurrence of this is to have these two defined live in different modules, so you won't actually notice these small differences. Defined is a function that you shouldn't use unless you really have no other option. The better solution would be to extract the file resource to a third place and require it from there. That way you can have it live in one place, and both other places that need this temp foo file to exist can refer to it, thereby circumventing this problem completely. There have been discussions on the mailing list about defined as well, and the general consensus is that you shouldn't use it unless you really have no other solution. And even then, there's probably a different solution.
For iteration before we get actual iteration, is that basically the
Yeah, sort of. You know, you should probably look for a different solution. It's very instance specific. In every case where you need it, there's probably a better solution. It just involves taking more different approaches. I see that I'm almost running out of time. This one is quite nice. Can anybody spot the problem? Yes. Even though there is no, so there's two things in play here. There's a circular dependency. The reason for that is that most people use before and require in order to set up dependencies. But notify, what not many people know is that notify and subscribe imply before and require. So when you put a notify somewhere, it also implies a before. Therefore, this results in a dependency loop. And luckily, Puppet will nicely notify you in the later versions. At least Puppet will nicely notify you and tell you which loop it is. But in earlier versions, it just told you there's a dependency loop. Have fun. And especially in this case, it's relatively simple case. But when that occurred over different modules, it would turn into quite a search to figure out what caused that dependency loop. Yeah, so be aware that notify and subscribe imply before and require. The other piece of advice is that if possible, stick to either require or before everywhere, and don't use them in a mixed mode unless you need to. Basically, you can almost always stick to require unless you need the dependency to go the other way around, then you can use it before. The same thing for notify and subscribe. They're just the same way of defining the same relationship, only the other way around. So stick to using the subscribe unless you need the notify. That usually, the only cases where that happens is when you need to put a dependency to a third-party module that is not yours and that you don't want to make changes to. Then you can resort to using it before or notify. This one is a very simple mistake, but you see it every once in a while, especially with people who are just getting started with Puppet. Yeah, this will actually work if this happens to be the location on your Puppet master that that file is in. It will actually work. I think in later versions it might actually turn into an error message, but the better way is to use this syntax. Puppet : I don't know why it's triple slashes. Can anybody from Puppet Labs elaborate on why?
Specify a host in there between second and third slash. So if you have
Same file that exactly use.
Okay, so the first two are the colon, and the first two slashes are the protocol, and then the third. Okay. It's been a question in my mind for forever, so we're doing new things today. Yeah, so use Puppet : / modules instead of using the full path to the file on the server. This has to do with the security a little bit, because the Puppet master actually secures the access to the files used in this way. And if you want to use a different server for as your file server, then that is also important. Yeah, can I do one more?
One more.
Alright. So, because this is something that we touched on before, instead of asking you, I'll just tell you what's wrong here. Puppet is unfortunately very bad at recursing through directories with many, many files. So, for instance, one of the cases we had a web server that people would upload files to that would start existing under different usernames, and we wanted to have them all owned by root if they weren't set to root, or all owned by the vhost user. The problem is that when you do this, Puppet starts going through every file as a resource, and it's extremely expensive. If you do this on a directory with hundreds of files and hundreds of subdirectories, it'll just start taking 10, 20 minutes easily. So it's currently a problem. You cannot do this. And the only other proper alternative that I could come up with is one that makes me cry personally, which is to use a horrible exec. Yeah, that's does anybody know a better solution to this?
Extended attributes.
Extended attributes? Enlighten me.
Well, like, can't you put an apple on the directory that will work?
Misuse a file system in ACL to ensure that the right users could read the right entity of the file.
Yes. Okay, yes. So take the problem outside of Puppet. Yes, that is also yeah, and fix the problem. The obvious solution is fix the problem where users upload files and they are owned by the wrong users. So that would be the end of my presentation. If anybody has any questions, feel free to find me later on. And thank you.